Again, thank you all for attending our EOHSI seminar series on field overview. Delighted to welcome Georgios Kelesidis. You can tell he's Greek. He's coming from one of Europe's Ivy League universities, ETH Zurich. You have to kind of sketch out very briefly, I would say. Georgios started his career from Greece, studying chemical engineering in Patras. Then he moved to ETH Zurich for his master's and PhD. He's young, but he already received a number of prestigious awards in his field of research, he was published, and he's not a usual speaker in these seminars in terms of content. He usually will have people focusing primarily on the risk assessment question, environmental science questions. George, his research is primarily at the interface of material science and climate change. He does a lot of things, modeling, makes materials. I think that makes him really unique. And we are all interested in climate change and health, not only at EOHSI, but across vectors and national level. It's an area that is really gaining interest, and having young scientists investing their time and talent trying to generate the information and data we need is very important. So George, welcome. I hope you're enjoying your time here at lectures at EOHSI, interaction with faculty and students. The weather was nice until this morning, but it's better than the weather in Zurich. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, all. Thank you so much for the kind invitation. It's a great pleasure to come here and first of all present after so long time in person. It has been a very exciting week, meeting many faculty members of this institute, having excellent discussions, many ideas coming up, and I'm very glad now to present you some of the highlights of my research so far, as well as some of the future angles of my research. So, as Professor Demokritou said, I'm an engineer, and generally I'm a material scientist. I would call myself, who works at the interface between material engineering, climate change, and a little bit in biomedical applications. The material that I have looked mostly so far during my research is carbonaceous nanoparticles. For example, carbon black is the largest nanomaterial that is made industrially today through combustion. Carbon black was firstly produced back in ancient China in 2000 BC. So back then, these brave Chinese workers, they would scratch the carbon black particles from the walls of these chimneys, and they would use them to produce their famous inks. Nowadays, of course, we don't use lamps anymore to produce carbon black. Actually, the industry is using furnaces like this one over here to produce 11 megatons of carbon black every year. Of course, we use these nanoparticles still in inks, but also in various applications, including paints and tires. So actually, because of the large range of applications of this nanomaterial, this industry is currently valued at about $10 billion. Now, in addition to this well-established industry of carbonaceous nanomaterials, we have emerging markets, such as those of activated carbon and carbon nanotubes. These nanomaterials are very porous and they have unique electric properties. And for this reason, they are used in very niche applications, such as in lithium-ion batteries that actually got the Nobel Prize back in 2019, in filters, as well as in sensors. So because of, again, the wide range of applications that we have for these novel nanomaterials, their markets are currently valued at about $5 billion each. And of course, we have nanomaterials that are relevant to biomedical applications. For example, we have carbon quantum dots. These are very small nanoparticles, below 10 nanometers in size, that have unique optical properties. As you can see over here, they emit a color that depends on their size. And because of this, and because they are also very friendly to human body, they are often used in bioimaging instead of other agents like heavy metals that they cannot really use in vivo. In addition to this, we have even newer nanomaterials, such as carbon-coated cobalt nanoparticles. These are essentially carbonaceous magnetic nanoparticles that are used in ferrofluids, for example, to clean our blood from toxins. I will explain a bit more later in my presentation. This is actually, there is a spin-off from my laboratory in Zurich, Two-Photon, that actually sells now this nanomaterial at about $50,000 per kilo. And for your reference, gold is about $42,000 per kilo. So carbon and magnets can cost nowadays more than actual gold. So we have all these precious nanomaterials that I'm giving you the numbers of the values of their markets. But in addition to all of these carbonaceous materials that we are producing by design industrially, we have a very similar nanomaterial to carbon black that atmospheric scientists call either soot or black carbon, and it is emitted all over the Earth. In particular, we have 8 megatons of this black carbon that are emitted all over the year, as you can see here in this map. Here, in particular, I'm presenting you the mass concentrations of black carbon emissions at different parts of the world. In Europe and North America, most of black carbon emissions come from road and air transportation. But as you can see, most of black carbon emissions are actually coming from Asia, from places like China and India. And this is because their coal and biomass combustion are still being used, for example, for energy generation. And of course, we have a lot of black carbon emissions from open fires, which I'm pretty sure you have seen on the news. Unfortunately, these black carbon emissions have become quite famous on the television, as you know, the Californian wildfires have created a lot of damage over the past few years. Now, these nanoparticles actually made it to the New York Times earlier this year due to their health impact. There was a study from Harvard showing that even small levels of black carbon or soot emissions can be quite dead, can have a huge impact on health. In fact, even small amounts of black carbon, it was shown actually in a study over here in northeastern United States, that it could increase by 6 to 8% the mortality risk. That was a recent study published by Harvard. Now, I would like to focus on United States and come back to what I described before, the wildfires, that has come due to climate change. It comes more and more often on the news. And here I'm presenting you the frequency of fires in United States. You can see here the map. And as one would expect, we have way more higher frequencies of wildfires near the West Coast, for example, in the state of California. And it has been estimated that the wildfires, just for the years between 2017 and 2019, they caused to the state 12 billion pounds of damage every year. And of course, they cause from time to time some human lives as well. It's not only the physical damage. But I would like also to point out, since we are on in the northeastern part of the country, that over here we have also a lot of house fires as well that can cause actually quite a lot of damage. We have 350,000 house fires in the United States every year that cause about $7 billion worth of damage every year, and most importantly, they cost the lives of 2,600 people every year. So it's actually quite important to develop sensors that can detect fast fires, either house fires and wildfires, so that it can prevent them in time, and save, of course, all these costs in terms of damage, but most importantly, save human lives. So actually, during my PhD studies at EOHSI, I collaborated with Siemens to work on smoke detectors that could detect fast and prevent house fires. So Just to explain you how these devices work, let me give you a case study over here, an armchair fire. So during such a fire, you have a lot of black smoke. This smoke contains of black carbon nanoparticles. And here is actually a microscope image. Okay, these nanoparticles, during combustion, they collide and they form these clusters, okay, these agglomerates, as I will refer to them quite often in my presentation. And as you can see, they are not perfect spheres, they are quite porous. So in the field of atmospheric science, we use a metric called mobility diameter to actually quantify their size. And it's the size of the agglomerate, of the total cluster, because this determines their transport, for example, how they settle from the atmosphere to the Earth, or how they settle when we inhale them in our lungs. So it's a very important metric, actually. Now, as these nanoparticles, as they are emitted from the fire and they enter the chamber of the smoke detector, they interact with a laser that has been introduced in this smoke chamber. So they scatter light at different directions. And over here in this chamber, we have receivers of light that essentially they pick up the scattering signal from these agglomerates. So during an armchair fire, this is how the sensor signal looks like. As the time increases, the sensor signal goes up because more and more smoke builds up, and the sensor signal levels off.
Earlier in the 20th
Please
century.
mute yourself.
It's recent 30 years.
Online, please mute yourself.
No problem. So just to reiterate, during this fire, we have the sensor signal that increases, and over time, as the smoke builds up in the room and it's full of smoke, everything is black, we have the leveling off over here. So these devices, they convert the sensor signal to number concentration of particles in the room using the Mie theory for spheres. So they neglect this porous and very complex shape of nanoparticles, and they just calculate the number concentration from the light scattering, assuming spheres. Now, even though this industry is quite well established, actually these devices are still not selective enough to light scattering by black carbon. In other words, their alarms may go off by nuisance aerosols that can be produced, for example, by toasting bread. Actually, before we had a very nice discussion with Professor Lombach, that he was telling me about aerosols that you have downstairs and created. How long ago? About a few
years ago.
Yes.
Yeah.
So even indoors, you have a lot of nuisance aerosols that can get you out of the building. And this is, I mean, it's fun to discuss it, but actually it costs a lot of money. Just in the United Kingdom alone, that they have done this the search to see how much these false alarms cost. It's about $1 billion per year. Of course, due to insurance and other related costs are accumulated. So smoke detection companies have to decide either they want to avoid false alarms, so they put the threshold quite high. But then, of course, this is a safety issue because you might lose fires and then you set people's lives in danger, or you put it low, but then you get a lot of false alarms. So we collaborated with Siemens to provide an engineering solution into this issue. We actually worked out, we developed a model, a discrete element model, to describe the morphology, the fractal-like morphology of these complex black carbon nanoparticles. I won't go through the details of this model. I will just put over here some schematics to describe very simply the processes. So over here, we don't have an armchair fire. We just have a candle, a simple ethylene flame reactor. Okay, and imagine that the black carbon nanoparticles, they are nucleated. They firstly form at very small heights above the burner of the flame, and then they move by Brownian motion. They move around randomly, and of course they collide with each other, forming these clusters that you see over here. But what was really new in the model that I have over here is that we also account for reactions between these nanoparticles and gases that are available in the flame. And for this reason, we can account for the growth of these nanoparticles. And also, you can see over here, we have different sizes of their constituent primary particles. So I'm saying all of this just to let you know that we account in excruciating detail for the morphology of these black carbon agglomerates. And having this simulated nanoparticles, we used them actually to develop a new light scattering model and provide it to Siemens to improve their fire detectors. So actually, we did some measurements in our lab. And first of all, we measured the light scattering signal from such nanoparticles. So here is the light scattering signal at different angles in the scattering chamber. So imagine if you look at the fire detector like this one over here, where you can put the detector at different places, at different angles in the chamber. And this is the light that the fire detector would catch up. So in principle, you would like to put it in small angles like these ones over here, where the scattering signal is large enough for someone to measure it. Now, here is the current model that the smoke detection companies use. So they assume spheres, and as you see it over here, the difference between measurements and model might seem small to the eye, but over here, the axis is logarithmic. So this overestimation over here is actually 60%, especially in these small angles that are important for industry. And this overestimation over here is essentially the reason why we have all these false alarms that I described to you earlier. Now, with the model that we developed over here, and you can see we have all these complex structures that I mentioned earlier, we can actually describe in very high detail the light scattering distribution by black carbon. They say we can even get the uncertainty, because you can imagine these are very random structures. So we can simulate a lot of them, and we can get the uncertainty area that you can see over here in terms of shaded area. So we can provide, how can I say, the error bars to the industry to design the smoke detectors accordingly. So the model over here is in excellent agreement with the data, and now Siemens is actually using this model to design the next generation of fire detectors that are more selective to light scattering by black carbon, and thus they are less prone to false alarms, and they can prevent house fires and wildfires way more effectively. Now, I would like to move away from fire detection and go to climate change. So here you can see a global map with a temperature increase induced by black carbon nanoparticles all over the Earth. So generally, one way to quantify the contribution of a given pollutant to climate change is either the temperature increase or the radiative or climate forcing by a given pollutant. And the previous IPCC report, a report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, had listed black carbon together with CO2 and methane as the three largest contributors to global warming based on their radiative forcing. But as you can see over here, the black carbon estimation had the largest uncertainty. And this was again because of the very complex structure that I showed you earlier, this porous structure that these nanoparticles have, and of course is way more complex than a simple molecule like CO2 or methane. So black carbon, of course, contributes to global warming either through the radiative forcing or, for example, as you can see over here in the Arctic, by deposition on the ice, on the glaciers. So here is actually a rather recent picture of the Arctic ice that is melting, and its melting is actually accelerated significantly by deposition of black carbon nanoparticles on the ice. And this is actually quite relevant, even for United States over here, as most of these nanoparticles are emitted by ships that are actually cruising around this area over here. So it's really important to quantify, first of all, accurately the contribution of black carbon to global warming, and then come up with policies that can help us mitigate its impact on our environment and, of course, public health. So now let me get to the specifics of how one can improve such modeling of climate change. So first of all, again, here you can see a microscope image of a black carbon agglomerate, but this time is actually out in the atmosphere for some time. So you see, we still have very porous structures, but they are coated by organics and other substances that they are out in the atmosphere. Now, the radiative forcing that I mentioned earlier is just a function of radiative forcing efficiency and the absorption aerosol optical depth, as it's called in the atmospheric science, which quantifies essentially the total light absorption from all black carbon emissions. This is all that I want you to keep in mind for the moment. And this is an important quantity because we can actually measure it. We have all over the Earth some photometers at different parts of the globe where they observe and they obtain through this aeronet network the absorption aerosol optical depth of black carbon. And we can actually use this quantity to see how accurate are the current climate models. So the IPCC models that were used in the previous report in 2013, they were calculating this absorption aerosol optical depth, assuming spheres, and also neglecting the coating of this structure, of the real black carbon emissions. And for this reason, you can see they underestimated this value, the total light absorption of black carbon, by 60%. Now, of course, the most recent models that were published just earlier this year in the newer IPCC, they account for the coating. The coating in general enhances the light absorption of these nanoparticles through the so-called lensing effect. If you have questions, I can explain you more in the Q&A. So the difference between the observations and the models was reduced. But you can see over here that we still had about 20% underestimation of the real light absorption by black carbon. So this still tells us that the contribution of black carbon to global warming is still underestimated by global climate models. So this is what we try to do to account for this. So we use the model that I described to you earlier that accounts for the realistic morphology of black carbon. And we interfaced it with the Rayleigh-Debye-Ganz theory to get, first of all, this property, the mass absorption cross-section, which quantifies the light absorption only for one nanoparticle, only for one agglomerate, first of all. So I won't go through the specifics over here just for the sake of time, but again, if you have questions, you can let me know. But the main point that I want to convey over here is that the light absorption of these agglomerates is enhanced by this factor, this 1.18, because the light is trapped. It is trapped in this porous structure of these nanoparticles. And because it is trapped, it enhances the total light absorption by this agglomerate. Okay. So we used this model, and of course we wanted to validate with measurements, first of all, that are done in laboratories, that you can see over here with the cross-hatched bar, and also measurements done at the exhaust of an engine. So first of all, here is the classic model for spheres, where you can see that it underestimates the measurements as expected by 20%, because it neglects the porosity of these nanoparticles. And here is the mass absorption cross-section that is obtained by our new model that accounts for the fractal-like morphology of black carbon. So because, as I said, we account for the trapping of the light in this porous structure, you can see that we improve significantly the agreement between modeling and data. And now we can use this, remember this is a light absorption for a single agglomerate, we can use it to get the total light absorption, the absorption aerosol optical depth of black carbon. So here we go back to the plot that I showed you earlier. These are again estimations by global climate models that are available in the literature. So the first thing that we wanted to do was to benchmark, to validate ourselves, so to reproduce these estimates. And as you can see over here, we made the same assumption for bare spheres as well as for coated spheres, and we reproduced the climate models. So this tells us that the procedure that we follow in general is correct, but still we still underestimate the observed absorption aerosol optical depth that is provided by the aeronet network of sun spectrometers. So when we actually estimate the total light absorption for bare as well as for coated agglomerates, we see that, of course, the total light absorption increases by 20 to 30%. And now you can see over here that the absorption aerosol optical depth that we obtained for coated black carbon agglomerates is exactly on point with the observations. So this tells us now that we can take this information over here that account this total light absorption of black carbon that accounts for the realistic morphology of these nanoparticles, and we can introduce it to a real climate model to have a better understanding, a better quantification of its contribution to global warming. So we collaborated with Professor Ulrike Lohrmann's group at ETH Zurich, and we used their global climate model, this ECAM-HAM, to get the distribution of radiative forcing across the globe. So here is the model's predictions without any change, just by using the default model of coated spheres. The dotted areas that you see, they show statistically not significant changes of the radiative forcing of the climate in these regions because of black carbon. In the United States, you can see that we have positive contribution of black carbon based on a radiative forcing of about 0.1 to 0.2 watts per square meter. But of course, you may have noticed already the red spots over here, which are areas that we still have high contributions, high emissions of black carbon that contribute to global warming. And in these areas over here, we have radiative forcing ranging between 2 to 4 watts per square meter. Of course, these hotspots were known already, but the predictions based on the observations that I showed you before suggested a radiative forcing ranging between 3 to 5 watts per square meter in these regions. So we have an underestimation of the radiative forcing by the current global climate models using neglecting the black carbon morphology. So now, when we do the same simulations, but we use the new model for the black carbon structure, we can actually see that over the globe, the radiative forcing increases by 25 to 50%. And in particular, in the hotspots of radiative forcing that I mentioned before, so in China, India, the Arabian Peninsula, and in sub-Saharan West Africa, the radiative forcing range is now from 3 to 5 watts per square meter. And now we can explain very nicely the estimates obtained based on observations. And this is actually quite important because these large radiative forcings are translated to a regional increase of the temperature by 2.4 to 4 degrees. So a huge increase of the regional temperature because of the black carbon emissions. So with this, I would like just to reiterate that we have now a more accurate model for the contribution of black carbon to global warming, and we can use it to assess different policies for its mitigation. Now, I would like to say that so far I have shown you my modeling work so far, but I'm also doing experiments. I'm working on particle generation by spray combustion. Like over here, this flame is a flame spray pyrolysis reactor. And with this setup, we can actually produce more or less any element from the periodic table. We can produce, first of all, silicon dioxide and iron oxide that of course, they have many industrial applications, but they are also natural aerosols out in the atmosphere. And very recently, it was shown that we can use this reactor to produce black carbon nanoparticles that are very similar to what is emitted in the atmosphere by different sources. So together with my graduate student, Ivanovic, we recently published a paper where we show that we can produce, by changing the combustion conditions in this reactor, we can produce black carbon nanoparticles that have the same mobility diameter. Remember, as I mentioned in the beginning, this is a property that determines the transport of these nanoparticles in the lungs and thus how they deposit in our respiratory system. So by changing the equivalence ratio over here in the flame, we're able to produce black carbon nanoparticles, the red, the orange, the green lines that you see over here, that have a similar distribution, size distribution with those emitted from actual aircraft engines. And furthermore, over here, due to the light, it's not shown that well, but these nanoparticles contain the same amount of organics with those obtained from actual aircraft engines. So this shows that we can use such a reactor to produce nanoparticles in our laboratory that are very similar to what is coming out from an aircraft engine. Now, what is the benefit over here? The benefit is that we can actually produce very large mass concentrations. Okay, so Of course, there are already commercial reactors that try to do this, but unfortunately, their mass concentrations are very low. While with the new reactor that we have over here, we can produce 3 orders of magnitude more particles in our laboratory. To better understand, I'm just showing you over here a picture of a vial with black carbon nanoparticles that are similar to aircraft engine emissions, and we just obtained this in just 10-15 minutes. So the idea here is that we can use this reactor to generate black carbon nanoparticles that are similar not only to aircraft engines, but different kinds of sources of black carbon emissions. And we can try, first of all, we can characterize physical properties that are relevant for their toxicity. So this is actually what we did over here in our recent paper. We managed to get the specific surface area as well as the porosity of these nanoparticles. It was not possible before because to do reliable nitrogen absorption measurements, you need at least a few milligrams, 20 to 30 milligrams, to do such measurements at the lab. And this, of course, you cannot obtain it easily from an aircraft engine. So here we are able to obtain enough amount of aircraft-like black carbon, and that way characterize its specific surface area. And also its pore size distribution that is important also for its climate effects. For example, to see how clouds are forming around these nanoparticles in the atmosphere. And again, this is quite important because the specific surface area determines the toxicity of such black carbon emissions. Now, before I move away from the black carbon part of my work, I would just like to highlight the impact of this research on public health and how, over this week that I talked with different people over here at this institute, how I see myself fitting with other people's research. First of all, I met Professor Georgios and Professor Robok that also do work on modeling, on climate modeling, and for sure collaborating with these people, it would help, to further increase the accuracy of climate models and have even better and more accurate predictions. Essentially, further reduce the error bar of our predictions for the contribution of black carbon to global warming. Furthermore, with the new faculty members, Memo Laurent and Mark Budolson, we can relate the temperature increase that we predict to health effects, as well as suggest new policies based on the predictions of our global climate models. With Dr. Buckley, this is related to the first part of the talk. We can develop new particulate and gas sensors to monitor, for example, disasters like fires and other combustion-related phenomena. And most importantly, we have here people working on toxicity, where I missed them all over here, where we can, as I mentioned earlier, we can use the black carbon nanoparticles that we produce over here in the lab to do cell studies, animal studies, generally quantify the toxicity of such nanoparticles, both in vitro and in vivo. And this is something that you cannot get easily across the world in one department, in one institute, to have all these people around. Now, however, I would like to say that the technology that I'm presenting over here, it cannot be used only to produce black carbon. It can be used to produce nanomaterials with various biomedical applications that have been actually documented quite thoroughly so far in literature. And I will just give you a small overview over here. So in the beginning, I mentioned over here these carbon-coated cobalt nanoparticles that are typically functionalized so that the toxins absorb on top of them, and they can assist that way the purification of blood. Furthermore, with this technique, we can produce luminescent materials like terbium and europium. And that way, with this phosphorus, we can assist the imaging of tumors. This is similar to the carbon quantum dots that I mentioned in the beginning. In the past, also, iron-based nanomaterials have been produced with this technique, such as iron oxide, iron phosphate, or iron sulfate, and they have been used to as nutrition supplements, essentially to increase the iron content of food, and that way address the needs of people with iron deficiencies. Furthermore, with this technique, one can produce nanosilver. As you might know, silver has unique antibacterial and antimicrobial properties And actually, this company, Heikyu, in Switzerland, they introduced these antiviral masks that contain nanosilver produced through flames in order to prevent more effectively the contamination from COVID-19. And finally, the most recent spin-off coming from this technology is a lithium that produces gas sensors. These are portable devices over here that can be connected to your phone, for example, and they can provide you, they can assist in monitoring of gases, any kind, or I mean, they can be tailored to take any kind of gas that you have in mind. For the moment, there are many papers showing, for example, the monitoring of air pollutants like benzene down to parts per billion levels, as well as markers, breath markers like acetone or ethanol. That ethanol, of course, is used to detect alcohol and generally avoid people driving drunk, but it is also linked to different diseases and disorders. Now, I myself have looked into materials with unique optical properties, like gold nanoparticles. Just to explain what I mean by unique optical properties, I'm showing you over here the light extinction efficiency obtained from single gold spheres as a function of the wavelength. So this quantifies, again, more or less how much light these nanoparticles absorb. And you can see that this spectrum over here presents a peak. That is, it is actually induced by the so-called surface plasmon resonance phenomenon. So when the wavelength of light is at the same frequency with the surface electrons of this nanoparticle, this essentially maximizes, to put it in simple words, the light extinction of these nanoparticles. So this is the first property that is unique for these plasmonic nanomaterials. The second one that is actually makes it quite attractive for biomedical applications is that these nanoparticles, they convert the light that they absorb into heat. So many times they have been placed in the vicinity of cancer cells so that after we shine light on top of them, they increase the temperature of these cancer cells and essentially they kill them. This is a so-called photothermal treatment of cancer. Of course, this might work in vitro, but in vivo, it's quite tough to use single gold nanoparticles for this. And the reason is the following. Our skin allows only light in the near infrared region to go through. And so these wavelengths that I'm highlighting over here. And as you can see, these single gold nanoparticles, they do not absorb any light in this region. So they are quite inefficient. They cannot be used in vivo. But however, with the flame technology that I showed you before, we can actually make agglomerates of gold nanoparticles similar to those that I showed you earlier for black carbon. Now, when you have clusters of such nanoparticles, their surface plasmon resonance, actually the enhancement is coupled. And for this reason, we have a second peak that's coming up, but it appears at larger wavelengths. And of course, it enhances the light absorption of these nanomaterials in the near infrared region. Of course, these are experiments. We can also do the modeling the same way that I showed you before. Again, I won't tell you with more details. I'll just show you over here that our models can accurately predict the light extinction for both single spheres, but also for clusters of gold nanoparticles. And the good thing with these models is that now, if we can predict accurately their light absorption and extinction, we can get actually their heat flux quite nicely. So how they increase the temperature around them. So without doing the experiment, you can do the calculation and have a prediction. And we can do this also for many different structures. So for single spheres, for dimers of gold, 7mers and 15mers. And that way, for example, we show that 7mers of gold nanoparticles can release up to 20 times more heat compared to single spheres in the near infrared region. So having both modeling and experiments, one can design the morphology of such nanomaterials from first principles. Now, these gold nanoparticles, they can also use to monitor molecules that have biological applications. So what is done commonly is to mix gold nanoparticles in a solution that proteins are present, but we don't know, for example, the length or the dimensions of such proteins. So in these conditions, what is happening is that the gold nanoparticles agglomerate and they form these clusters that I showed you earlier. But we have a gap in between them because of the coatings with proteins. And of course, the formation of these clusters changes the optical properties of these nanomaterials, as I showed you earlier. In particular, the position of the light extinction peak changes as a function of the protein coating thickness, based on this relation that I'm showing you over here, and actually that we derived based on the simulations that I showed you before. So by coupling this relation with measurements, light extinction measurements in blood containing gold nanoparticles, we are able to measure the protein dimensions in blood, but in particular for proteins ranging from fibrinogen, histone to albumin and gamma globulin. Actually, this paper just got accepted a couple of months ago, so you can find again more details there. And in addition to gold, the last nanomaterial that I have, or one of the nanomaterials that I have worked with, but the last one that I will show you for today is serum dioxide. So in the beginning of my PhD, I worked with metal oxides, such as serum dioxide, and I doped them with europium, a luminescent material, as I mentioned earlier. And by making this very unique composition of nanoparticles, we are able to design a sensor that can detect hydrogen peroxide in biological media. In particular, this sensor was able to detect hydrogen peroxide down to 5.2 parts per billion. And hydrogen peroxide, maybe you have heard, it's a common marker for different biological processes. So it's very important to detect even small amounts of such a compound. So with this, I would just like to summarize that with this kind of nanomaterials, we can make robust sensors that can detect different gases, as I mentioned, or generally molecules, even in liquid phase, that provide us new insights in biological processes and generally diseases that concern public health. Now, of course, coming to Rutgers, I would like to explore new research areas, including the sustainable food production. So the growing human population always requires a larger amount of food that we need to provide. But due to climate change, we need to provide large amounts of food using less energy and less water resources. And nanotechnology can actually provide solutions to such emerging societal problems, like, for example, using sensors similar to those that I showed you earlier. In this regard, your institute has members that have already worked on this field, such as Professor Demokritou, who developed, for example, in this case, water-based aerosols that contained natural pesticides like hydrogen peroxide and citric acid. Again, in this case study, these water droplets, essentially, that contain these compounds, they were sprayed on top of spinach leaves to clean their surface from E. coli. Here at the top, you can see the control microscope image from the control leaves, but they were not sprayed, they were not treated with water. And below, you can see the ones that were actually treated with these water droplets. You can see the impact is huge. And so, using such nanotechnology, you can actually ensure also the food safety and this the food safety that we need to ensure for sustainable food production. So it's quite exciting for me to come to an institute that has already such infrastructure and members that have already worked in such emerging research fields. And of course, I would be very excited to work over here with colleagues from other departments from the Department of Engineering, such as Professor Chen, Professor Tsilomelekis, that would help me develop new functional materials, as well as to characterize them in detail for various applications. With this, as I think I'm running out of time, I will just present you over here a summary slide with the different applications that I've worked on, and I'm looking forward to answer all your questions.
Thank you, George. eye-opening presentation. And as we always do, we'll open the floor for questions and then we'll go online. Yeah, questions from the audience.
Thank you, George, for that very interesting talk. Kick this off. I have two questions for you. When you said that the material can be used to purify blood, what are you talking about removing from the blood?
Different toxins, different organic compounds.
Organic compounds?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay. And the other question is, carbon.
Well, just to be more clear, at least back in that time, they had tested only organic compounds, the funding ended from that group. So I think there is, if you're interested in other compounds, we could also look into that.
No, I thought maybe you meant antimicrobial.
No.
Okay. The other question is, carbon in different forms like nanotubes is known to be highly inflammatory and fibrogenic. Has this form of carbon been tested in rodent bioassays of the respiratory tract or anything, or is that
By this form, you mean particles like this, right?
agglomerates?
Yes. They are less inflammatory than carbon nanotubes. Nino Kunzli had actually, and his collaborators in Basel, they had looked into cell studies mostly of carbon nanotubes versus diesel exhaust, black carbon, and they are less, their cytotoxicity was smaller compared to carbon nanotubes, but it's still significant. But they are, I mean, due to the shape also, of course, they are less inflammatory compared to carbon nanotubes.
Thanks.
Just to add on this question before we move to other questions, you mentioned your ability to simulate aircraft emissions in terms of carbon black.
Mm-hmm.
And you presented, I think, a nice figure in terms of matching the specific surface area. How about all the other chemical properties? For instance,
So,
pH, content, and other things that we do know.
just a moment. Yeah, I mean, over here in this slide, there is a shaded area over here that covers the organic. I'm not sure why it's not displayed well. The point is that actually here the organic carbon quantifies these polyaromatic hydrocarbons that you mentioned.
So you might
have, yes, exactly. We have exactly the same amount when we specially measure it the same way.
And you're doing this by using a flame spray pyrolysis.
Yes.
Like the one we have on the floor.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, that's, in our approaches to various toxins, we're trying to simulate in control experiments and match environmental properties of toxins. And that's the only way you can do structure activity relationships for toxins. So this can be, I haven't thought about it, because we do have this platform in our labs here. And there's a lot of research right now related to aircraft emissions and people living in the vicinity of airports.
Exactly.
So this kind of approaches, I think they're really very helpful if we want to study toxicologically this kind of pollutants. So thanks for clarifying. More questions? Yes, Michael.
Could you go back to the slide that shows the global map?
This one?
Yeah, that's a good one. So you showed us China, you showed us India. What's happening on the Arabian Peninsula? And that looks like Nigeria, roughly in Africa.
A lot of ports here.
That's not industrial. Is that coal or is
It's
it?
mostly through the ports. They have a huge shipping traffic over here. There's a lot of black carbon. I mean, it's more compared to China, but still compared to the rest of the world, it's the shipping. In Arabian Peninsula, again, you have some ships, but they still have coal and biomass combustion that contributes. I mean, also over here in this part, but here, as you can see, in this part of Africa in general, they are higher because people are using.
Does it have anything to do with oil extraction?
The extraction, not so much. It's a industry nearby that is burning oil and fossil fuels that contribute in the Arabian Peninsula, especially.
Now, in central Amazonia, there's always an annual issue of fires. Is that?
Yes, that's why you see this peak over here.
Yeah.
That's a main source of black carbon in this
So it's
region.
different sources and different
Yes,
parts of the.
it's actually, I think, like the third or fourth slide that I have. Sources. Yeah, over here. The major sources, I mean, coming from this region. You also have open fires over, like in Africa, some forest fires that contribute as well.
Now, if you go back to your map, you don't show any in California. You have this huge.
The implication is that as bad as the fires in California were, there's
Still
more
less.
burning elsewhere.
The wildfires contribute, but the emissions overall, they are not as large as, for example, the coal and biomass combustion that we have in these areas. There are still a lot. I mean, it's still an important contributor, and especially in terms of public health, because the emissions from such fires can cause quite some inflammatory responses, as the Harvard study mentioned here.
Yeah, the first time I went to China and I took the train down from Beijing down, I was in the fall, I was actually astounded that they have all these wheat fields and so on. And they take the wheat and then they just pile up the straw and burn it. And
Yes.
it's just like, the whole country is a fire. It's
Yeah.
just amazing.
They do the same thing in the rice fields in Thailand.
Well, actually, this is happening in New Jersey as well. Preparing for the next season, farmers are doing these control fires quite a lot.
But
And
these are like mountains of straw.
Yeah, of course, I mean-
I've never seen anything like it.
Right.
It's just
the thing is,
This, where is that?
in China, northern China, around Beijing.
China, Indonesia, they have these huge biomass fires prepared. More questions? Please.
Yeah, I guess, the modeling, showing that you're looking at the agglomerates, set of single particles, and then looking at the coating, it's really elegant, sort of showing how you could approximate the radiative forcing better. But I would think that agglomerates of black carbon don't stay as single agglomerates of black carbon either in the atmosphere, right? They agglomerate with other
Yes.
materials, and is it possible to account for that and even be more accurate?
This actually, it is accounted at the moment by climate models, is so-called external mixing, as they call it. So they coagulate with other materials. So this part, current global climate models account for it. So we just use the current modules and algorithms that they use. Of course, one could further look into it and see how accurate it is and how it affects. But in general, it's just an averaging between the properties of two as soon as they mix.
Because like co-emissions of like brown carbon is like reflective, right?
Yeah.
Or generally, and that it seems like very complex.
Well, it's mostly organic carbon, brown carbon.
Yeah.
So yes, it's mostly reflective. And for example, biomass combustion contributes a lot to organic carbon. This is, as you said, mostly reflective and cooling. So it depends. There again, it's an engineering problem. There are regimes of biomass combustion that are producing more black carbon, and thus they are warming the climate. And there are regimes, linear, that are the most common ones, that are actually producing organic carbon, and it's reflective. So there, for example, it's a policy matter to say, for example, to set up the conditions that one should use for biomass combustion to avoid black carbon and warming.
Thanks.
Please.
So if you're doing tumor imaging with nanoparticles, were those that you were showing up converting dyes?
As the golden now.
The gold or the phosphorescent,
Fluorescent.
the fluor, yeah, the europium and terbium. This one, right?
Yep. I'm just asking if they were up converting dyes.
What do you mean by up converted?
Fluorescence from a higher wavelength to a lower wavelength.
This I need to look it up, but yeah, that's actually why we played the colleagues that did the study, why they played with the composition. So over here, in order to increase the up conversion of the range of wavelengths that you are doing, you can play with the composition of materials to maximize it, to optimize it,
So
essentially.
the advantage of the up converting is so if you excite the dye, if somebody inject it or whatever, you use, say, a long wavelength, 980 nanometers, laser or something like that.
Yes.
Fluorescence will come back at a lower wavelength, which you can detect with the imaging system. And what you really want out of that is long penetration of the infrared
Yes.
to allow you to image the tumors.
So over here, these nanoparticles are actually the luminescent ones are actually on a host. That was a purpose of it, to allow the light to penetrate through the human skin. Essentially, it's the discussion that I had later for gold, right? This one over here. So you want the light to penetrate through the skin. So you want actually support for these luminescent nanoparticles that absorbs light in this region. And we have developed solutions for this, like titanium nitrate. So if you deposit these luminescent particles on titanium nitrate, it's a material that absorbs everywhere. It's actually black, like black carbon. And it absorbs very strongly in the near infrared region. So there are solutions either for the phosphorescence or generally for this application, for the photothermal treatment of cancer. We are looking into materials that we can maximize their absorption in this window, and they are also cheap because, okay, we made these agglomerates of gold and they somehow absorb more over here, but they are quite expensive. So another point from an engineering point of view is to make such a material that is actually cheap. And titanium nitrate that we actually produced rather recently, back in 2018, it's such a good solution because you can use it as a support for your bioimaging agents, and it absorbs strongly light in the infrared region.
So let me follow up with that for just a second, because I'm not quite sure I understand. When you talk about a two-photon transition, which is really what you're talking about in terms of absorbing at a longer wavelength and emitting at a higher. First of all, that's a rare process. You've got to cascade just the right energy levels to get that whole thing to work. But if you're emitting at a shorter wavelength, you're just as likely to be absorbed on the way out from the tumor as you were from the way in on excitation. So I'm not entirely sure how that process might work in terms of conversion. But I had another question, Georgios, real quick. How did you characterize when you're mimicking the emission or the particles from the plane, okay? And you say you matched functionalities. How are you characterizing those to say that you've got? I mean, I understand you can match the amount of organic versus black carbon and things like that, but how do you actually characterize the profiles themselves? You know, the rough pHs in each category, et cetera, et cetera.
For the pHs, I mean, over there they don't have mass spectroscopy measurements from aircraft.
So it's IR, it's NMR or something else that actually.
Yeah, we match the Raman and IR spectrum. That's the techniques that we have data available out there. People have gone through the engine and they managed to do the IR and the Raman. And with this, we managed to validate mass spectroscopy. We have done for our black carbon from our planes, the detailed mass spectroscopy spectrum. I don't have it over here.
Okay.
My graduate student has it. But it's some information that actually is missing out there because different compounds can induce different inflammatory responses. So that was an information that was missing, and you know we hope also in the next paper to provide this answer as well.
George, thank you so much for the great talk. It's great to see you again after so long time, and it's great to see your progress during all these 15 years that I know, right? I know you, right? So I can definitely see kind of an overlap at the last part of your talk, where you started talking about the extinction coefficients and also cerium-based materials or titanium-based materials in catalysis and surface enhanced Raman spectroscopy. but I wanted to go to the first part, which is totally out of my comfort zone. So please forgive my question if it's too naive, right? So you talk about these cells that cover the carbon black, the carbon dots, the carbon blacks, I'm sorry, and that how these can impact your model. So if we assume that these are staying on the atmosphere, right? I was wondering, I know that the carbon black is a relatively stable material. How these cells interact with UV and whether they have kind of a reasonable half-life rate constant that may affect your long-term and short-term predictions in your model.
That's an excellent question. You just described the so-called photo bleaching that's happening out there because of the UV. It changes the structure of the coating, but it doesn't change the refractive index of the coating. So this actually does not, we have actually investigated this and introduced a small uncertainty in the model predictions. I'm pretty sure that in terms of inflammatory response and public health, changing the structure of these molecules would be important. But for the optical properties, essentially how much light they scatter or absorb, it doesn't change much because let me go back to the respective slide. Let's go to the single spheres over here. What's happening is that the coating acts as a lens and essentially directs more light towards the particle. So this is the most major effect in terms of impact on the black carbon nanoparticle. So even though the photo bleaching changes the structure, this still reflects the light towards a black carbon nanoparticle and enhances the light absorption. So, but actually, there is so much uncertainty out there because they are mostly field studies and they just, measure over time the impact. So having something in-house where, for example, you can coat these nanoparticles and in a controlled way, you can shine UV light and see how it changes and do an operando Raman or IR. That would be,
Yeah, let's talk about this.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. More questions? Any questions from the people online? Please unmute yourself, identify yourself, and ask the question.
Hi, Mark Rudolphson. I've got a question, if that's good. Hi again. I've been thinking more since our conversation yesterday, and I wanted to get your reaction to sort of a pitch building on that. It's like I was telling you about how we have this existing NSF grant, and I wanted to see what you think about piggybacking on that for like a future grant application or papers. And the thing that I realized is I think the black carbon implications of different specific technology portfolios are already going to be natively estimated in the modeling we're already going to be doing. So again, it's like estimating for different decarbonization policy portfolios that are being considered, what the health co-benefits magnitude and socioeconomic distribution would be for the next 50 years or so. So I feel like we could pull out of this preliminary results on which of these representative technology portfolios are better and worse with respect to black carbon. And we could also then think about and have estimates of, at least among those, which of the different black carbon reducing policies have more or less health co-benefits and what is their socioeconomic distribution. And then as a further thing, like I think I'm interested scientifically in what you think about this too. It seems important to me that we could make progress on thinking about the timing of black carbon removal under these different technology portfolios at different locations, and what the net warming effects implications would be of that, which seems especially important given that the black carbon problem is going to take care of itself to a large extent, because as the developing world gets richer in the coming decades, that's just going to take care of the problem sort of naturally. But the timing of that isn't obvious. And of course, we would want to accelerate development, all things considered, on net in different ways, and see how that timing interacts with the implications of the different policy portfolios for, the opposite cooling effect of other aerosols that dominates the black carbon warming effect on net, but how much it dominates, of course, and where and at what timing could really differ in interesting ways.
That's a very good comment. I mean, as you say, the timing, all of this, how have you done these calculations? I think you need to have a global climate model to test these kind of scenarios, right? So
yeah, it's
essentially,
GCAM, and we can also supplement it with gains and stuff. But GCAM is sort of the workhorse.
I think that essentially you have a climate model where you can test the different timings of the black carbon removal and what is the overall impact of each policy, especially, as you said, in terms of removal of reflective aerosols that actually cool the environment. I think that's the most important aspect. And of course, there are different sectors that will, they will decarbonize, or at least they will remove black carbon more or less effectively, like aircrafts, for example. I don't see the transition happening any time soon. Trucks, generally road transportation, yes, for sure. I mean, this will change rather fast, and the black carbon emissions from there, the issue should be taken care of itself. Coal combustion with stricter policies in other countries as well, also I think so. But there are areas where black carbon, for example, can contribute through the formation of clouds, especially through the aircraft engines that I mentioned earlier. Its contribution to global warming or cooling needs to be estimated more accurately in all of these scenarios as well. Because my collaborator, Professor Lohmann, in Zurich, her group focuses on the cloud impact, on the impact from clouds formed from different kinds of aerosols. And for example, for black carbon, a couple of years ago, she showed that, again, you have a warming effect. So if you still have emissions of black carbon from aircrafts, but most likely their decarbonization is going to be delayed, you will still have a positive contribution from such emissions. Does this make sense or answer your concern?
Yeah, it all seems exactly right. And it wasn't so much of a concern as in a sort of less expert way than you just gave it, emphasis of how interesting it could be to look at exactly the timing implications of the different policies exactly, and what the net effects could differ in different ways for different precise policies. So happy to pull out preliminary results or collaborate more or talk more about this if it sounds interesting at any point. We'd love to do it.
Me too.
More questions from people online or from the audience? Michael, the last question.
Well, there's nobody else online.
Yeah, no, they left.
And I wanted to ask, so two movements are beginning to coalesce. One is the climate movement, and the other is the global population movement. And it's probably no accident that those dense spots in India, China, and Nigeria are in some of the most densely populated parts of the world. It's anticipated there are going to be another 1 billion to 1.5 billion people in Africa before population stabilizes. Presumably that's going to be a lot more biomass fuel running. How do you see that being countered or offset?
I mean, we need, that's why I would like to provide solutions through nanotechnology. We need new fuels, alternative fuels, biofuels. We need batteries, renewable sources. I have not presented these over here, but for example, we're looking into ways to convert pollutants into materials for energy storage. I think the only way forward is by developing new engineering approaches to assist, the growing needs of the world in terms of energy, in terms of food, as I presented earlier. I think we have to work towards it. Otherwise, well, I mean, the problem is not going to solve itself. We need to provide new engineering solutions as soon as possible.
Okay, I think we need to stop here the discussion. We can continue our lunch. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, George.